David's earliest memories were of a family that had seemed perfect, at least to him. It was a small house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where kids rode bikes in the streets until the sun went down and where neighbors knew each other by name. The house smelled like fresh bread on Sunday mornings, and the sound of laughter was a regular visitor at the dinner table. David, at 6 years old, didn't know what any of the complicated adult words meant. He only knew what it felt like to be loved. And he was loved by his mother, Emily, who was always there to kiss his scraped knees, tuck him in at night, and tell him that the world was a beautiful place. And by his father, Frank, who could make him laugh so hard he forgot his own name, who would take him to the park and let him sit on his shoulders as they marched through the grass like soldiers. But it didn't take long before things started to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the laughter that once filled the house became strained, like a song played out of tune. Frank's moods shifted, from jovial to distant, from loving to unpredictable. He started coming home later and later from work, his clothes reeking of something that didn't smell like cologne. David didn't know what alcohol was, but he knew that it made his father's face red and his voice slur. At first, it was just the occasional drink, and David thought nothing of it. But then it became more frequent, and the nights grew longer, and his mother began to look at Frank with an unreadable expression. David had never seen his mother like this before, sad, quiet, and unsure of herself. One Friday night, when David was still in first grade, it all came to a head. He was sitting in the living room, his favorite blanket wrapped around his shoulders, the TV on in the background, but his attention focused on the arguing voices coming from the kitchen. His mother was trying to keep her voice steady, but David could hear the hurt in it. Frank's voice was sharp, louder than usual, and it made David feel small, like he wasn't allowed to be in the room. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't understand what. All he wanted was for everything to go back to normal. The next morning, things changed forever. David woke up to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and weary, her eyes red from crying. She didn't say much that morning, only telling him that his father wasn't coming back. "Daddy's not going to live with us anymore," she had said, her voice breaking slightly, but she still managed a small smile. "But it's okay. We're going to be just fine." David didn't understand what that meant. To him, his father was everything. He was the man who had taught him how to throw a baseball, the man who had held him when he was scared. The thought that Frank wasn't coming back made David's stomach twist. He packed his suitcase that day, just like he had seen the grown-ups do when someone left for a trip. He thought maybe his father had gone away for a little while, that he would come back soon. He couldn't imagine life without him, but Frank didn't come back. The weeks that followed were a blur of silence and uncertainty. Emily tried to keep things normal for David, but the cracks in their world were starting to show. She worked long hours to support them both, her face often drawn with fatigue. David could feel the strain between her efforts to maintain a sense of stability and the deep sorrow she carried in her heart. She never said anything negative about Frank. Even when he didn't show up for David's birthday, or when he missed the Christmas dinner, or when he stopped calling altogether, Emily never once raised her voice in anger. She would just shake her head and say, "Your dad loves you. He's just going through a tough time." David didn't know how to process it. His mother's unconditional kindness only confused him more. Didn't she see what Frank had done to them? Didn't she know that Frank had stolen their savings, leaving them with barely enough to make it through the month? Frank had taken Emily's bank card, emptied their accounts, and then disappeared without a word, but Emily never blamed him. Not once. Not in front of David. The first time David stood by the window with his suitcase packed, waiting for Frank to come and take him away, he was 7. It was a Saturday, and David had packed his little suitcase with clothes and his favorite toy. He set it by the door, just like his mother had always done when they went on family trips. He knew his father would come any minute. He had to. This time, it was different. Frank had promised him that he would come. David sat at the window, staring down the street, waiting. The hours passed. The sky turned from blue to orange as the sun set, then to purple as the stars came out. Still, Frank didn't come. David didn't cry, he just waited. Emily noticed. She didn't say anything at first, just walked past David, rubbing his hair gently as she set the table for dinner. She hadn't said anything about Frank's visit, because she knew what that meant. She knew that David was still holding on to a dream, a hope that his father would return. That night, Emily didn't say a word about Frank. She just tucked David into bed, kissed him on the forehead, and whispered, "Everything will be okay." But David didn't believe her. Not that night. It became a routine. Once a month, sometimes twice, David would pack his suitcase and wait by the window. Each time, his heart broke a little more. He learned to stop expecting his father to show up. He learned to stop hoping for a man who could never be counted on. And yet, he never stopped loving Frank. Even as his father faded from his life. During those years, Emily never stopped supporting him, never stopped loving him. She would make up stories about how Frank had to work, how he was too busy to come, but one day, he'd show up again and everything would be right. David clung to those stories because, for him, they were the only way to understand the father who never came. As the years passed, David's heart hardened a little more. By the time he was in 5th grade, he had stopped packing his suitcase, but he still sat by the window, watching the world go by, waiting for a father who would never come. It was in 6th grade when Emily remarried. Her new husband, Steve, was different from Frank. He wasn't loud or angry. He didn't drink. He wasn't a mystery, a figure who came and went. Steve was there. He was present. He took David to baseball games, showed him how to tie a tie, helped him with his schoolwork. Steve didn't replace Frank, but he was a steady presence, a father in ways Frank never could be. At first, David resisted Steve. It wasn't that he didn't like him, it was that David couldn't let go of Frank. He couldn't bring himself to let someone else be his father. But over time, Steve's kindness wore down the walls David had built. Steve was patient, understanding. Steve showed David what it meant to be a man, not through harsh words or tough love, but through everyday actions. Steve wasn't perfect, but he tried. And David could see that. Still, every time Frank's name came up, every time someone mentioned his biological father, David would shut down. It was easier to ignore the truth than to face it. Easier to pretend Frank didn't exist, but Frank hadn't disappeared for good. David was 11 years old when his mother remarried. He was still young enough to cling to the hope that his life could return to the way it was, when Frank had been a hero in his eyes. But by that point, the dream of a reunion with his father had begun to fade into the background, replaced by the harsh reality of being raised by a single mother in a world where his father never showed up. It had become clear to David that Frank wasn't coming back. But in the quiet corners of his heart, David had always believed that maybe, just maybe, Frank would return to make things right. That belief was shattered on the day Emily married Steve. Steve wasn't the man David imagined would take Frank's place. David had pictured someone older, maybe a friend of his father's, someone tough and rough around the edges. Steve, however, was nothing like Frank. He was calm, quiet, and steady, a man whose presence could fill a room without demanding attention. At first, David was suspicious of him. He'd seen how men like Steve were always too nice, always too perfect to be real. Steve wasn't flashy. He didn't buy David presents or try too hard to win him over with grand gestures. He simply was. It started with small things, like how Steve would make pancakes on Sundays or how he'd walk with David to the corner store for snacks. At first, these little acts of kindness felt strange to David, as if they were part of a dream he didn't want to wake up from. He didn't know how to respond to this man who seemed to care about him so effortlessly. But, over time, Steve's steadiness became a source of comfort. He didn't try to replace Frank, he simply filled the gaps Frank had left. David still missed his father. There was no way around that. No matter how much Steve tried, there was no replacing the memory of Frank, the man who had been larger than life in David's mind. But as the months passed, David realized that Steve was a father in ways Frank had never been. He wasn't perfect, but he was there. And that, David realized, was the thing he needed most. It was the holidays when David's relationship with Steve started to shift. For the first time, they had a proper family Christmas. Emily, Steve, and David sat around the tree together, just the three of them, and it felt good. No fighting. No tension. Steve didn't try to pretend he was the father figure David needed. He didn't try to outdo Frank. He simply accepted David for who he was. It was the first time in years that David had felt like his family wasn't broken, that there was something solid, something that could be counted on. That Christmas, Steve gave David a set of baseball gloves. He didn't know if David liked the sport, but he thought it might be fun for them to play catch together. David wasn't sure at first. He still felt the absence of Frank at the edges of his mind, like a shadow that never left, but he accepted the gloves. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. He'd never gotten anything like that from Frank, not since he was a kid. And then, a few months later, the letter arrived. David was finishing up his homework in his room when Emily came in and handed him an envelope. It was white, the handwriting neat and familiar. It was from Frank. For a moment, David's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from his father in over 2 years, not since the day Frank had sent a birthday card that was as impersonal as a grocery store receipt. It was strange to hear from him now that he tore the envelope open and began to read, his eyes scanning the words as his mind tried to make sense of what they meant. Dear David, I know it's been a long time since we've talked. I'm sure you've wondered why I haven't been there. The truth is, I've been going through some tough stuff. I've had my own problems, but I'm sure you've figured that out by now. I don't expect you to forgive me for disappearing, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused. But I want you to know that I've always thought about you, that I hope you're doing well. I hope you've grown into a fine young man. I didn't come to your graduation because I didn't want to make things worse between us. I figured it was better to stay out of the way. I also wanted to let you know that I'm doing fine now. Your mother and we never really worked out, but I'm sure she's told you her side of things. She always made sure you were okay, and I'm grateful for that. Anyway, I don't know what else to say. I guess I just wanted you to know that I'm thinking of you. I don't expect you to respond. I just wanted to clear the air. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. I'll be around. Frank. David put the letter down slowly, his fingers shaking slightly. He read it again. And again. The words didn't make any sense. It was as if Frank had written the letter to someone else, someone he didn't know, someone who wasn't his son. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years he'd missed, no recognition of the damage he'd done. It was just an impersonal, detached note from a man who had never taken responsibility for anything. David's stomach turned as he realized the truth. Frank wasn't interested in his life. Frank wasn't interested in repairing their relationship. Frank was only writing to clear his conscience. To check off the box, to make sure that when David's mother died, when the estate was settled, there was no claim on his part. Frank didn't want David back in his life. He simply wanted to make sure there was no unfinished business. The letter sat on the kitchen table for a week. David didn't speak to anyone about it. He didn't know how to explain what he was feeling. The old hurt had resurfaced, but this time, it was different. This wasn't about the disappointment of a missed visit or an empty promise. This wasn't about the man who had promised to show up but never did. This was about the man who, when he finally did show up, had nothing to offer but excuses. David's resentment had been smoldering beneath the surface for years, but now it erupted. The realization hit him hard: Frank had never really been his father. Not in the way he needed, not in the way a father should be. Frank had been a ghost, a distant figure who only showed up when it suited him, a man who used his family as a stepping stone to avoid his own failures. It wasn't just that Frank hadn't been there for him, it was that Frank had never cared enough to try. One afternoon, David sat down with Emily and Steve after school. He felt the weight of the letter in his hands, the words still stinging in his chest. "Mom," he started, his voice quiet, "I got a letter from Dad." Emily looked up from her work, her expression unreadable. "Did he say anything important?" she asked gently. David shook his head. "No. Just excuses. He said he's fine, that he didn't come to my graduation because he didn't want to make things worse. But he never came. He hasn't been there for years. And now he just wants to clear his conscience." Steve, sitting across from them, said nothing, but David could feel the tension in the air. Steve didn't know what it was like to be abandoned, to have a father who never cared. But he understood enough to know that the pain wasn't about Frank anymore. It was about the man David had hoped Frank would be, a man who never existed. David didn't want sympathy, but the weight of the letter crushed him. It felt like a final nail in the coffin of everything he had once hoped for. And for the first time in his life, David realized that Frank was not a man worth waiting for. It was that night that David made a decision that he didn't need Frank. Not anymore. He had a new family now, a family that didn't hurt him, didn't abandon him. Steve was there. Emily was there. And though he might never forget the pain Frank had caused, he had learned that there was more to family than blood. He didn't know it yet, but this realization would be the beginning of his transformation. The old David, the one who had waited for his father to return, was gone. The new David was ready to let go. It had been 10 years since David had last seen or heard from his father. After graduation, after everything, David had let go. He'd built a life for himself, a career, a wife, children, friends. He was a man now, one who had learned to find his own value, not from the approval of his father, but from his own efforts and the people who truly cared about him. When his first son, Alex, was born, David felt something inside him change. Fatherhood was different from what he'd imagined growing up. It was full of love, yes, but also responsibility, and David was determined to be the kind of father he had never had. He swore to himself that he would never abandon his kids, never let them feel the ache of a father's absence. That he had long since stopped thinking about Frank. His father's name, once a bitter reminder of everything David had lost, no longer carried the weight it once did. Frank was a ghost, a memory he had buried deep in the past. David had his family now. He had people who loved him. He didn't need Frank's approval, nor did he care for any of the empty words Frank might offer. But then, the call came. It was a Friday afternoon when the number appeared on David's phone. The name on the screen made his stomach drop. Frank. David stared at it for a moment, wondering if it was some kind of mistake. His father had never tried to reach out before. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, not even when David had graduated from high school. And now, after all these years, here was Frank, calling him as if nothing had happened, as if all the years of abandonment, neglect, and betrayal could be swept away with a single phone call. David didn't answer. He didn't have to. Frank hadn't earned the right to be in his life. Not anymore. But then Frank called again. And again. By the fourth missed call, David had enough. He picked up the phone, ready for the confrontation he had avoided for so long. "Hello?" David answered, his voice steady but cold. "David? Son, it's me. Frank." David's stomach churned at the sound of his father's voice, older, weaker, but still unmistakably his. For a moment, David didn't know what to say. His father's voice was a ghost from his past, and hearing it again after so many years made him feel like a teenager again, helpless, unsure, waiting for something that would never come. "Yeah, it's me. What do you want, Frank?" David's voice was sharp, his patience already thinning. Frank cleared his throat, and David could hear the tremor in his voice. "I know it's been a long time, and I'm not asking for anything from you. Not really. But I need to talk to you. There's something important." David felt his anger rise, but he kept it in check. His heart beat faster, a mix of curiosity and resentment. What could Frank possibly want after all these years? A donation? An apology? A reason for his years of absence? "I don't have time for this," David said, cutting him off. "What's so important that it couldn't wait until now?" Frank hesitated. I'm not doing well, David. I've got diabetes, and it's been getting worse. One of my organs is failing. They told me I need a donor." David's stomach tightened. For a split second, he felt something he hadn't expected: sympathy. Frank was sick. His father, the man who had abandoned him, was dying. But then the truth came crashing down. "And you want me to donate?" David's voice was thick with contempt. "After all this time? You just now want to talk to me because you need a kidney or a liver or whatever? You think I'm just supposed to drop everything and help you?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. David could hear Frank breathing heavily, and he imagined the man was lying in some hospital bed, desperate. And then Frank spoke again, his voice softer now. "I know I've been a terrible father, David. I'm not proud of it. But I need your help. You're the only family I have left. You're the only one who could help me now." David closed his eyes, his chest tightening. His mind raced. This was the moment he had imagined in countless dreams, the moment when his father would come crawling back into his life, asking for something. And now that it was here, David felt no relief. Only disgust. "You don't get to do this to me, Frank," David said, his voice sharp. "You don't get to just waltz back into my life because you're dying. You abandoned me. You disappeared when I was a kid, and you've never once tried to make it right. You stole from my mother. You were a coward. You're not my father. You never were." Frank's voice cracked. "I'm sorry, David. I don't know what else to say. I know I messed up. I know it's too late for me to fix it, but I don't want to die alone. Please. You're my son. You're my blood. I'm begging you." David sat down on the couch, gripping the phone tightly. The flood of emotions, anger, betrayal, resentment, felt overwhelming. He had spent so many years convincing himself that Frank wasn't worth thinking about. But here Frank was, still trying to manipulate him, still trying to use the bond of blood to get what he wanted, and for a moment, David could feel the weight of everything that had happened, the years of waiting for a father who never showed, the disappointment, the hopelessness. It was all coming back, and it was crushing him. But he couldn't let it control him anymore. He couldn't let Frank have any more power over his life. "Frank, you're not my father. I don't owe you anything. I don't owe you a kidney or a damn thing. You don't get to ask me for help after all these years. You've never been there for me, and I'm not going to start caring about you now just because you're dying. You don't deserve that." There was silence on the other end of the phone. David could hear Frank's breathing, ragged and weak, but he didn't care. He wasn't going to let this man guilt him. Not anymore. David's voice softened, but there was no trace of sympathy. "I'm not a charity, Frank. You're not going to use me to save your own life. You were never a father to me, and I'm done pretending you were. You're a ghost, and that's where you belong." He ended the call. David sat in the silence that followed, his body shaking with adrenaline and anger that he had done it. He had said what needed to be said. For the first time in his life, David had taken control. He hadn't begged for approval, and he hadn't let Frank manipulate him. He had broken the cycle, and yet, as the phone call ended, there was a strange, hollow feeling in his chest. For all the strength he had just summoned, for all the anger he had expressed, something about the finality of it felt incomplete. Frank might have been a coward, but the weight of his absence had never fully gone away. David sat in the quiet of the living room, his eyes on the phone as if waiting for it to ring again. It didn't. After a while, David stood up, walked over to the window, and stared out at the neighborhood. His family, his life, everything he had built, it was real. It was solid. And Frank? Frank was nothing more than a fading memory, a distant figure who had never deserved a second chance, but David didn't feel victorious. He just felt free. A few weeks later, David received a letter from Frank that it was a short, impersonal note, one that almost seemed like an afterthought. Frank thanked David for not agreeing to the donation, for giving him closure, and expressed his belief that David was better off without him. The letter ended with a postscript: "I'm going to die, but I hope you find peace. And I'll always remember you." David read it once. Then he threw it away.